Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall Podcast. I'm here with my co-host Kate Riga, and we record the Josh Marshall Podcast on Wednesdays at noon, and I had some, you know, someone, an electrician, coming by my apartment yesterday, so we delayed. But right as we were delaying, we had the news break about Stephen Breyer uh, retiring from the Supreme Court. So it's sort of fortuitous in the sense that you know it's good that we waited a day because now we have a better sense of kind of what's going on there. That's obviously the big news, for this episode of the podcast. And we were just, discussing before we went on the air, um, where's the drama going to come in here with the retirement of Stephen Breyer and the nomination of it seems like there's like two or three people it's probably going to be. It's a relatively short list that people are focusing on. And, in the old days, there was always this when there was a nomination, there was always like, is there going to be a surprise pick? And, outside the box, are you going to play it close to the vest or go long? Kind of like a, with Democrats, it was always, are you going to kind of try to have a Democratic Scalia, like an ideological anchor, or are you just going to go with someone who is, more a consensus candidate? And I think one of the things I think we've learned with Joe Biden, you're not going to get a big surprise. You're not going to, it's not going to be someone you never heard of. And from what I can tell, um, the the kind of people who invest a lot in these decisions, by which I mean, the people who are court watchers and all that kind of stuff. From what I can tell, the three or four people who've been mentioned as probable nominees, everybody's kind of fine with all of them, and they all seem good and whatever. So not no big drama there. And I mean, there's maybe some inherent drama in what seems likely or almost a certainty the first African American woman on the court, but no drama, kind of more drama than that already. We know that's coming. Um, And so we were talking about, so what's, is it just, are we just going to kind of have a lot of ruckus and then a 50-50 vote that where Kamala Harris breaks the tie, or what's going to happen? Or is Joe Manchin going to, is this going to be, BBB 2, right? Or voting rights 2? Well, just before we turned on the recorder here to start the episode, there's that radio show. So we have this talk radio show down in West Virginia, which has been the sort of the origin point for Democratic despair over the course of 2021. Like whenever everything seems to be going great, and Joe Manchin wants to let everybody know that it's not going great, that in fact he's torpedoing the whole thing. He goes on that talk radio show and drops the information there. Well, Kate was just looking right before we started recording, and I guess he just went on that show this morning and basically said, "Yeah, these people look fine. I'm going to vote for it." I'm not sure it wasn't exactly those words, but that kind of thing. That he's on board. There's no drama. It's kind of done and done, which doesn't, as Kate was just saying. I was going to say it doesn't really surprise me because he doesn't really have any big interest in having this be difficult. I mean, I don't think Joe Manchin exactly wants to hurt Democrats or hurt Joe Biden, but to the extent he had points he wanted to make with the Build Back Better, I mean, he's made those points pretty resoundingly, and he's made them with the filibuster. Um, so it doesn't surprise me, and yet I am also accustomed at this point to thinking Joe Manchin's on board. And well, okay, obviously he's not on board, and in fact, he's going to blow up the whole thing. So that's good to hear. I mean, maybe it won't turn out that way, but so far so good. So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about this pretty scary and dangerous situation in Ukraine with Russian troops and heavy armaments kind of stacked up at the border between the two countries. And then we're also going to talk about redistricting. We've had some sort of semi-unexpected things happen on the redistricting front, and I guess that is that has been one of the things about redistricting over the last few months. I think everybody, for very understandable and very good reasons, got so hyped up about it is going to be the biggest disaster ever. Like Republicans are basically going to, gerrymander Democrats into one House seat in the whole country, kind of thing. Um, that it hasn't been quite as bad as people expected. And again, that's not a high bar. But there's also been a pattern where even federal courts in fairly conservative districts have just said no to some things, or state courts. I Kate will know better than I am able to remember, but I think Ohio is a case like this. Even state courts, and I believe even state courts that are run by if not nominally Republicans, Republican appointees, basically saying that's too much. You can't do that. You got to try again. So we're going to talk about all that. Before we get started, let me remind you that the Josh Marshall podcast is brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee. So you got hooked on $6 iced oat lattes and $5 nitro cold brews. It happens to the best of us, but a few months and a few $100 later, you're ready to become your own barista. Making cold brew at home isn't rocket science, but it is messy, not to mention the need for grinders and strainers, unitasker brewing containers. I don't even know about these. This sounds like what's the it sounds like kind of Breaking Bad kind of thing. If you want to make cold brew at home the easy way, order Grady's Cold Brew Kit. It's a simple and space efficient way to make a week's worth of coffee without the mess. Ready to give it a swirl? Get 25% off at Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. That's that's great. That's Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. And I've used that kit a bunch of times. Easiest thing in the world. So the little bag, you put the bags in. You got a little kind of plastic sealable bag. You get the little bean bags, toss them in, put some water. Let it sit for, I think it's 12 hours, maybe 24. I can't remember. I think maybe it's 12, and you're good to go. So it's good stuff. So, Kate, what is the deal with the Breyer, nomination thing? Are we finally going to
Yeah,
have some non-terrible news here?
it kind of seems like it. I guess let's start with the way that this news came out because I thought it was kind of strange. You thought it was less strange. Let's just talk about it. So, what happened was it came through the press, it came through basically all the biggest, like networks, NBC, CNN. They all kind of had it within moments of each other in a way that's what you usually see when there's, a purposeful leak. When someone is trying to get information out very quickly and very loudly, you're going to give it to the places that have the biggest platforms. And that's kind of how this happened. But then it was weird because so we get all these reports, Breyer intends to retire, and then nothing. Kind of hours elapsed without an official statement from Breyer, an official statement from like the press outfit at the Supreme Court. You had Biden kind of brushing off questions and saying, he hasn't made a statement yet. I'll talk about it when he does. And now, things have kind of solidified today, in a matter of minutes. Actually, we're recording this just before 12:30. Biden is gonna have a speech in the Roosevelt Room. Breyer's gonna be there, everything like that. But you know, yesterday it really was just a full day of just reports that he was going to retire without really any solid confirmation. And I saw one. I wasn't familiar with her, but I guess she is a commentator on Fox sometimes, or a contributor did shared some reporting that Breyer was, you know, perhaps upset or surprised with the way things had gone, that he didn't intend to announce his retirement yesterday. So what do you make of all that?
You know, I I don't think this is true, but in a kind of a conspiratorial, funny sense, I did kind of wonder, like, maybe the White House kind of got wind of it, but thought he'd get cold feet and just sort of said, "Hey, yeah, he's retiring. You can quote, you can cite it to me," because there's been so much Democratic demands, desire, begging, don't put us in this position where for no reason at all you're going to give this seat to Mitch McConnell. It was a little odd at some level, but the thing I thought about, and you and I talked about this yesterday, that I remember when Anthony Kennedy retired, that they did it as this kind, this press event with Trump at the White House, and I may be misremembering, but that felt out of character to me. I didn't remember in the past when there was a retirement that the justice went and kind of glad handed with the president like that. That's these things are obviously very political, but that seemed the kind of not how it's done. So, and again, maybe I'm misremembering this, but that's my general memory that that's kind of not how business is usually conducted. And so it didn't surprise me necessarily that um, that Breyer and the White House hadn't like coordinated this and everything. But uh, my best guess is that um, he wanted to do this yesterday. I'm sorry, he wanted to do this today. It got out. It does, as you say, it does seem like a kind of a standard organized plan released to everyone. It's not like whoever reported it first got a big scoop. And even though it was out there, he didn't want the court to put out like a thing saying, "Yeah, he's retiring." But wait, he's going to make a real announcement tomorrow. So and that's kind of awkward and everything. So I don't have a great explanation. I think it's some, I don't know, mix of that. But um, yeah, that's my take on that.
Yeah, and I'm sure our listeners are well aware, but just to remind everyone, the reason Democrats wanted him to retire so badly is not, because he's an unreliable kind of liberal vote on the bench or because people don't like how he's come down on decisions. It's because he's 83 and everyone's really worried that, he'll hang on until Republicans, retake the Senate and then kind of, go the way of RBG, which is that dies at an inopportune time. And Democrats have lost their chance to put, a young liberal on the bench and to kind of push back a little bit against the
Or at least
insanely
or at least
weighty
sort of
conservative.
reinforce the three-person
Right.
group. I mean, I think it's important to say that there is an entirely possible scenario where after January 2023, I mean, you could be 20 years, but there's a very plausible scenario that 6 years until you have a chance to have another Democratic nominee, at which point Breyer is what, 89 or 90. It's like playing with fire. And as much as for very good reasons, Ginsburg is sort of now a kind of sainted figure in the world of uh, both feminism and liberal jurisprudence. We can't forget the fact that during Obama's second term, um, during her first term, she had already had a very serious cancer, right? That was not a cured cancer, a kind of a managed cancer. She was very old. And so, again, as much as everybody celebrates her for great reasons, we would have been in a very different situation if she would have decided to retire while um, President Obama was still president. We would not be here right now. And people are, for very understandable reasons, you know, we look what happened,
Yeah.
Breyer. Like, look what happened, dude. And I certainly get it from the other side. You're Stephen Breyer. You've been on the court for more than a third of your life. I think he's, roughly 30 years, maybe a little less than 30 years, maybe 28 years, something like that. Um, and, you are You've been in this pinnacle position. You are an old man, but still, entirely on top of things. You're doing what you see as this critical thing. And everybody, and kind of a bunch of people a lot younger than you are saying, "Hey, you're probably going to die soon. You better retire. Come on, retire, man." I mean, that's a little rough from a few, from a few different angles. Not just the no one wants to hear that about themselves, but also kind of if you see yourself as doing this very methodical, jurisprudential work, clearly he felt and feels diminished for someone to say, "Hey, you know, we got to sub someone else in. We need another member of Team Blue to be there. So you got to leave." Um, I get that that's not welcome. I mean, I completely get that. I completely get his, resisting and not being happy about it. And I suspect there's a lot of, you know, I suspect he's not doing this terribly happily. On the other hand, and this really, to dig a little deeper into this, there are a number of interviews, statements he's made over the last couple years, basically saying, "Hey, the court isn't just political. It's not just Democrats and Republicans. We need to preserve this, kind of hallowed thing that is not just partisan politics." And yet, the reality of the world that we are living in, it may not be for him, but he has come to embody the sort of myopia of what is increasingly the old school liberal jurisprudential world, where you're holding on to that idea, which, whether or not that was ever the case, it's definitely not the case now. For people my age, especially, your age, Kate, you see what happened after Anthony and Scalia died. You see what, you just, it is brass tacks. And this is where conservatism in many ways is going to stack the deck in our political system. And that's just the reality. And it is a sad thing to recognize that for maybe a mix of personal and ideological reasons, he has been very committed to not recognizing that reality. And that's kind of why we had a pretty bumpy path to this day.
Yeah, I mean, I too kind of recognized the painfulness of being shouted out about your mortality all the time. And I agree with you that it is probably not very pleasant for someone who has like risen to the top of the legal world to hear essentially, you're just a vote for the lefties. We'll put someone else on who will also be a vote for the lefties. I get all that. But the stuff he said about, well, the court's not political, blah, blah, blah. It's really reminiscent of Manchin for me in the way of like bipartisanship, we can work together. It's these men speaking platitudes from a bygone era, and it's not just kind of quaint, it's really dangerous because it's turning such a blind eye to the damage that'll happen. And in this comparison, they both happen to just be gatekeepers of a tremendous amount of power, and letting their decisions be ruled by this kind of outdated nostalgia is just leaving a lot of vulnerable people very open to being hurt. So that notion kind of trumped the "it must be hard to be old" sympathy that I had for him.
Yeah,
Um,
and again, I mean, I was one of those people saying, "Dude, you got to retire. You
yeah.
have to retire." It's not that I think that anybody was unfair to him. It's more just recognizing, like, I see where that would bum someone out, right?
Mhm.
And there's, in some ways, this is a kind of a larger context to the whole judicial appointment, um, very unfortunate capture of the judiciary, not only by the judicial right, but in a broader sense by the academic legal academy in general. there's this guy whose name escapes me at the moment, a law professor about my age who, I don't know, maybe teaches at UCI or somewhere. I can't remember. Pretty hotshot, notionally liberal law professor type, who's the one who wrote a thing for Bear, like, oh, she deserves it. Liberal, you're making a mistake. She has great integrity. I know her. She's conservative, but she's top flight. You should put her on the bench. It's a funny thing because it's that kind of elite legal academy capture of the whole process. This isn't like being a doctor. It's not like controlling, it's not like making sure the nuclear weapons and nuclear energy isn't blowing up, right? This is a self-referential kind of system of reasoning, which is great, but it's not a science. And with guys like this one person I can't whose name escapes me at the moment, there is this tremendous myopia because kind of like, dude, to the extent you're looking for your judgeship too, you're gonna get it because of the political work of Team Blue. This isn't like you're the smartest reasoner and all this kind of stuff and kind of this that's nonsense. You're operating in this world and you're going to advance in it because of Team Blue if you do. Um and when someone like that says, "Oh, hey, we're 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 legal academic professionals here. We're a little bit above this red blue stuff you guys play around with." And Amy is top flight and a just a very incisive legal reasoning person. So you got to put her on the court. There's a sense of like, dude, you only get all this stuff because of Team Blue, and on the red side because of Team Red. So don't be saying you're above us. You have this kind of like, you guys are all very smart. You have this kind of body of reasoning, history, great, great, great. But you're there because of Team Blue. And don't forget it. And Breyer, in his own way, he's also there because of Team Blue. And he kind of forgot that.
That argument is so silly to me for so many reasons. The whole, you know, they're a smart person, they deserve to be on the bench. Who said anything about who cares, frankly? Who cares? I mean, it's pretending like these people, A, did not grow up in the political currents of our time, which they have, and B, that their judicial philosophy is completely divorced from a political philosophy, which just makes no sense. It's not about who deserves to be on the court. You want to put someone on the court whose worldview aligns with your own. That's not a crime. That's not something to be embarrassed about. It's just part of this kind of rebranding of the court as somehow on this island that is untouched by the political currents the rest of us are ruled by. And it's just dumb. Dumb.
Yeah, that the whole thing of like, deserves, like, vis-a-vis who?
Right.
This is kind of like, we live in a democracy. So, there certainly is an argument that it's not just ideology. You want someone who's got some judgment, not to do crazy things just because you want, just someone who, what they used to call a judicial temperament. There's what you want, there's your philosophy, but there's a greater interest in building consensus, slow as it goes, blah blah, all that kind of stuff. Um, so that's true. But in this whole deserves thing, like, it really is the elite legal academy really thinks they kind of own the court. It's
Mhm.
another tenured position in their academic framework, when in fact, this is how we in a democracy run the country. So kind of like, why does um, a 30-year-old woman who cares a lot about reproductive rights owe it to Amy Barrett to put her on the court?
Right.
That's absurd. Or frankly, why does a I mean, I'm trying to, I know I'm stumbling into the very crude stereotypes here, but why does a 45-year-old woman who is deeply pro-life, why does she owe it to whoever, to Ruth Bader Ginsburg to put her in the court? That's absurd, 'cause this whole idea of, like, that you're, like, objectively the smartest or the best legal reasoner. Like, who cares about that? Or even kind of like when say integrity, like, dude, I'm assuming you guys are not gonna steal the money. Or like, I mean, integrity. I mean, that's a baseline. I'm not impressed by that. So yeah, it is this whole kind of capture beyond right left stuff, capture again, like it's another tenure position
Right.
on a
I
on a
mean,
on a on a law faculty.
and not to mention that something like judicial temperament for years was considered the province of only white men. So it's not, kind of an objective standard by any means. All it's really meant is that now we only ever have people on the court who like went to Yale by and large. But, now we have this new piece, which is that Biden a long time ago vowed that if he got the chance to put a justice on the court, he would pick a black woman, which has sparked, I think a lot of excitement from the left, the idea of, getting to kind of rally around a historic figure. And then on the right, you've gotten a lot of, the kind of trolley Twitter presences saying, how's that not racist? How is not picking that's sexist, that's racist, we should pick someone based on blah blah blah, not, their characteristics like this, as which is just, oh my gosh, drives me crazy because it's what a false dichotomy, as if Biden is suggesting, picking a black woman who doesn't know what a court is or does versus picking some white guy who was top of his class at Harvard. Like that's not what anyone here is talking about. And it's
Well,
just, such a way to kind of rabble rouse.
yeah, well, I have been not sure surprised. It has been bracing to me to see how immediately and directly a lot of, quote unquote legitimate conservative, pundits and influencers have basically said like, "Hey, that's kind of weird. You're only, you know, enough with the black women, okay? You've already picked a lot." Like, really? Like, are you really saying that so directly? I mean, the other part of this is that um, the judicial right has been pretty open in recent years that as long as you went to a decent law school and had a passable clerkship, and if you're a right wing ideologue, you're good to go. You don't have to have written the most genius law review article or, whatever other kind of. This is clearly, we looked at all 350 million people. And when it comes to justicing, this person has is the smart, they don't even do any of that. So this whole, I mean, I saw that one of the guys, the guy who did that whole Zillow thing during Brett Kavanaugh's um, nomination with the whole thing of proving someone else, kind of going into old house records and proving it was someone else who
Mhm.
assaulted that Blasey Ford woman or something, just kind of nonsense, kind of saying like, hey, black women are only, it was something like only 4% of lawyers, and you're doing half of your nominees are black. Like really? This is, I mean, look, it is. You don't even have to say historic whatevers. uh, the Democratic Party, the two anchors of the Democratic Party are African Americans and women. So, like, you know, yeah, black women are going to get a number of nominations. There's nothing surprising about that. Certainly nothing scandalous about it. That's
Well, I
that's
mean,
that's
and
politics in a good sense.
it stopped being a headline during the Trump administration that he was nominating people to the federal bench who, didn't even pass kind of the bare bar association's like stamp of approval, I mean, these were like you say, I mean, people kind of fresh out of school who had done
Well,
not much of anything except prove their loyalty to the
yeah.
the red cause.
Yeah,
So,
people who didn't even really meet the standard I was saying, which is kind of, sort of like the Trump standard, which again, you went to kind of a top 10 law school, you you clerked with someone's heard of, and that's, you're good to go. But yeah, during the Trump administration, you're getting a lot of people like, oh, this guy worked for Jared for a while, so That's that's good. That's good enough.
Yeah, and, so the other thing of this, kind of in addition to it being a
And can
bit
I
of a
and
yeah, go
pardon,
ahead.
I just want to say the three people who are being considered now are each at the top of the sort of the legal profession. One is a justice on the California Supreme Court, another's in the DC Circuit. So again, we're coming at from multiple angles of the offensiveness of this commentary. These are like extremely top of their field people. And did Joe Biden promise he would nominate a black woman? Yeah. And there's that, and that's fine.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, this is kind of a continuation of the thing that Biden has been most successful at in his term, which is making huge inroads with the federal judiciary and specifically putting a great emphasis on elevating people of color and women. It's really been kind of, I think, one of the underrated, most important parts of his presidency so far that we just haven't heard about because I think there's not the same clickability to a story about Joe Biden kind of really successfully reforming the federal bench as there was with the kind of, Trump puts up another nutcase, it's his 800th
Right, right,
person, the
right.
courts will never be the same kind of story, which definitely dominated the coverage, a few years ago.
And I haven't. I'm gonna kind of just have an asterisk over this because I haven't prepped for this, but I believe that the woman who's being considered, who is now in the DC Circuit, also was a public defender before, kind of before she became a judge, or or in her background. And that is another thing that has been a very big deal under Biden. That basically the model of both parties for many years has been you're either you were a prosecutor or you're a professor, and that's how you get into judging. And the idea that you get a public defender is kind of like people who are letting off criminals. That's beyond everything. And there's been a big push within the kind of democratic jurisprudential world that kind of not every judge should come out of being a prosecutor. You want some people who came out of the other side of being a public defender. And I believe that is at least part of her background. Again, I didn't prep
Yeah,
specifically for
that's
this, so
right.
it's possible I may have that wrong, but I believe that's the case.
That is right, yeah, and so by the end of his first year, Biden had gotten confirmed the most judges to the federal bench since Ronald Reagan's first term. So that's a big deal. And part of, I think, why it's flown under the radar, and then I think this will segue us to something else I wanted to talk about before we moved on from Breyer, is that Democrats have pretty much said yes to everyone. It's been a kind of drama-free process, the getting these people confirmed to the bench, and obviously that includes Sinema and Manchin, who have famously thrown breaks into pretty much everything else that Biden's tried to do, but not judges, you
Hmm.
know?
Hmm.
And in some ways, like you talked about in your monologue, that was not a solace to me because I don't think it's beyond the pale to imagine now this judicial confirmation becomes the big subject, the thing everyone's talking about, and Manchin and Sinema, who love being the center of attention more than anyone else, could suddenly get a notion in their idea of, you know what? We need a bipartisan judge or some other kind of meaningless thing like that. Now we've seen, like you mentioned, Manchin basically said in this interview that he doesn't have a problem with a judge who's more liberal than he is, which seems to kind of indicate which way he's leaning on this. Cinema, of course, we have heard nothing from and won't until she drops some kind of statement or something. But there's also the fact that both of them, plus 3 Republicans, Collins Murkowski and Lindsey Graham, all just voted for specifically, Jackson if she ends up being the nominee just last summer to elevate her to the DC Circuit Court. So, in the realm of what drama we expect, there's not really a lot of obvious stuff to point to. It might actually end up being as low key as will any Republicans vote with the Democrats to confirm whoever the nominee is. We'll see. You can expect Republicans are going to do some oppo digging on whoever the candidate is, but at least right now, it looks, knock wood, kind of surprisingly smooth based on everything else we've watched go through Congress so far.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that with a Supreme Court nomination is not like anything else. It's not just a souped up version of a circuit court nomination, not even to the DC circuit. In the sort of the legal nominations world, people pay attention to those things, but those things never, barely ripple into the A section of a paper, right? It's just different. And I do think someone like I don't based on what we've seen, I don't think this is going to happen. But it's the kind of thing that one could see happening, that once it becomes the big thing and everybody's asking Joe Manchin each day, he's going to start thinking, well, okay, well, maybe this, maybe that. You don't want that to happen. I don't think that's going to happen. And I do think it's going to, go basically through. And I suspect, I mean, look, there's this is entirely up to Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema. Republicans have literally no cards to play, administrative cards to play, blocking cards to play. Um, I suspect they are not even going to try, like really try. And that's for a couple reasons. One is you're at 6-3.
Mhm.
Republicans don't really need 7-2. Sure, they love it, but they don't need it. This is basically just kind of, to be crass about it, locking in the third for Democrats. They don't really have any cards they can play. So I suspect what they're going to do is spend all their time trying to define this as soft on crime, BLM, on team Antifa, all this kind of stuff, and then frame it that way, and then have all the Democrats who are up for election in the Senate vote for it, and try to and that's their play, because they're not going to be. I mean, again, it is purely up to Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema, or for whatever reason, some other Democrat would, and that's not going to happen. So I think it'll basically go through fine. And again, Republicans will just use it as a messaging opportunity, um, in pretty crass ways. The one kind of substantive thing is that if it is someone who has been a public defender, like, oh, let's talk about all the murderers she helped, all, that kind of stuff, in a period when crime, for all of the politicization of it, there has been a spike in crime during the pandemic. That's just a reality, and it's more politically salient. I think that's what's gonna happen. It is what it is. Not like the Democrats can't try to define it in their own way.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, it's kind of like how Republicans will treat a very prominent, powerful woman of color is not, a huge surprise. They basically run the same playbook every time. Even when they couldn't decide whether Kamala Harris was a cop or Antifa, they just kind of tried to play both. Dangerous in some way seems to be, the default with her, with, AOC getting wall to wall coverage every night on Fox. That's just kind of what they do. But I think, the part of this that shouldn't be understated is that it's also a huge boon for the other side. I think it really does give Democrats something to be excited about. And perhaps most importantly politically, it gives Biden and co something to point to be like, see, this is why it's important that you voted for us. Our legislative agenda has run into roadblocks, but if you hadn't put a Republican in the Senate, if you hadn't voted for the two Georgia senators, this is not the situation we'd be in. So in that way, I think it gives a big kind of morale boost to a constituency that sorely needs it at this point.
Yeah, and I think, although again, I would not rely on it. I do think this is another reason why, Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin are not going to make trouble, because it, in addition to whatever substantive reasons why they're actually fine with this, there's a lot of broken glass on the ground in those relationships, and even for them, I don't think, uh, it wouldn't. They have no interest in creating more turbulence within the Democratic caucus at the moment, even them. So there you go.
All right. So let's move on to the Ukraine Russia situation, which is kind of looming in the background of everything right now. We're basically in a situation where Russia has put more than 100,000 troops, along with armor and missile systems, on its border with Ukraine. Seems like they're going to invade. Maybe they won't. People are doing a lot of kind of trying to read Putin's mind at this moment. Um, the United States has about 8,500 troops on high alert. Um, and it's just this kind of tense situation. There are negotiations ongoing, various kind of groupings of people meeting and trying to figure out what's going on. Um, and and Biden has basically said, if Russia invades, he said it would be the most consequential thing that's happened in the world in terms of war and peace since World War II. But right now, the White House is kind of maintaining this position of, I think trying to comfort people that it's not going to be America's war if Russia invades, while kind of trying to balance responsibilities to, you know, whatever responsibilities there are to Ukraine, and this idea that America can't just sit by and let other countries invade other countries and be okay with it. So there's all that mix going on. So kind of what do you make of it, and what do you make of Biden's options right now?
Well, I think there's a few different parts of this. One is that the U.S. is not going to attempt to militarily block Russia from doing anything in Ukraine. And when I say militarily, I mean with the U.S. military can sell them weapons, can sort of support them, can and I suspect will do like very draconian sanctions, kind of economic warfare. Um, but we have no treaty obligation to Ukraine. And it's good that we have no treaty obligation to Ukraine because that is, you know, that is well, it's just good, and it is on Russia's border. Um, I think that Biden has done a pretty good job with a pretty limited set of options. This is up to Vladimir Putin. How the and it 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 is hard to overstate the degree to which this is, this isn't a kind of a process of a number of things happening and it's gotten to this point. Putin just kind of up and did this and just kind of started mobilizing and said, "I'm going to invade." And it is very understandable from 30,000 feet what is going on here, and even understand. I mean, look, Russia certainly Putin's vision of Russia, and that is a big part of Russian identity. He speaks for a lot of people. Sees Ukraine as a region of greater Russia. Doesn't see it as really a real country. It's just kind of that's something that happened when the Soviet Union fell apart. And the United States and NATO is trying to kind of, bring that part of Russia into their system. And that is both a kind of historical offense and a security offense. And if it's not going to be part of Russia, it at least needs to be a tractable satellite state that follows Russia's lead in national security and everything else, right? And that is what Russia had when Viktor Yanukovych was the president, and his overthrow, that whole thing, and which sparked the annexation of Crimea. That's what this is about, and really this has been going on for almost since the end of the Soviet Union. Um, but this is kind of out of the blue in a basic sense, and I think has a lot to do with Putin's understanding of his own legacy, that he's trying to repair the things that he thinks were done wrong to Russia at the end of the Cold War. Um, and but here's the thing that I think has been underplayed in the U.S. coverage of this. This is a very dangerous situation, It's a very bad situation for Ukraine. There's not a lot of grays here, but this is also a pretty dangerous, high risk situation for Russia. And you know, the big question is, what does he want exactly? Again, big picture, everybody understands what he wants. He wants a tractable satellite state in Ukraine that follows Russia's lead and doesn't make trouble. But what does he want specifically here? How does he expect to get to there? And I think that, as best as we can tell, what he wants to happen is this: they launch into the eastern part of Ukraine. They drop a lot of bombs. They really maul and kill a lot of people in the Ukrainian military. And they break so much stuff that the Ukrainian state crumbles. Zelensky resigns. It all kind of falls apart under that kind of stress. Some pro Russian people come in and say, okay, I'm taking over. And now you've got your Yanukovych style state there. The problem is, what if that doesn't happen? What if you break a lot of stuff and kill a lot of people, and you at least temporarily occupy a big part of the eastern part of Ukraine? And what if they're kind of like, okay, we're still fighting you. We may be losing, but we're not giving up. At that point, what does he do? He, he Most of Ukraine does not want to be part of Russia, doesn't want to be occupied by Russia, is may have some ambivalence about, kind of whose orbit they're in, but they don't want to be dominated by Russia. The parts of Ukraine that are heavily populated by ethnic Russians and may want to be annexed or set up a little mini state, they've already kind of taken those. It's like a couple provinces in the east. But if that doesn't happen, suddenly you can't just say, okay, I guess that didn't work and leave, because that's humiliating. But then you're going to try to occupy the whole country or a big part of the country. Then you're occupying a country's hard. And so suddenly you're faced with a lot of really bad options. And so I think what this is all this, if Putin really wanted to invade, he would have done it already. And he hasn't. So there's a lot of risk here, and it's just it, it's it, it's just a bad situation. And I think that Biden is handling it about as well as he can, which is basically to say, look, we're not going to commit to you that Ukraine's never going to come into NATO. We're certainly not going to commit to you not to defend NATO allies. To the extent that you have real security concerns, we'll talk and try to, you know, give you some assurances, but we're not going to do those things. And that's kind of just that's what it is. And if you do something, we're going to kind of throw everything at you in terms of sanctions and cutting you off from the rest of, cutting you off from the European economy, world economy, blah 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 blah. So I think he's doing a pretty good job with a very bad hand. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I think on the one hand, just the impossibility of Putin kind of sustaining an invasion or an occupation is contributing to the mindset of some people who are like, I think, maybe this is a bluff. Maybe this is an attempt to kind of exact Western concessions without going all the way. But then on the other hand, I think you have people who know Putin really well and know that he has shown in the past a tendency to be impulsive and a willingness to kind of go forth with plans that are not baked through. So I think that's kind of contributing to this sense of precariousness and a sense that you might not be dealing with a wholly rational actor, which always I think just kind of, ups the stakes and ups the worries. And then I think, the way that it's funny because foreign policy is so often kind of ignored by a lot of especially the very DC kind of, the newsletters, the that kind of sect of the Beltway media. But because before this Breyer thing happened, Congress is on recess and Biden didn't really have anything planned. Suddenly, Russia Ukraine became the only game in town. So that's what a lot of people were, kind of basing their coverage on. And then a lot of it is, this is important for Biden, especially because of the botched Afghanistan rollout. which is interesting, I think, because it's almost a little bit of this, the blob, the kind of conservative Washington mindset of weakness. This amorphous idea of weakness is, debilitating, needs to be avoided at any cost. Often that manifests in very kind of belligerent positions, very bellicose positions. You know, I still don't really understand what the anti-weakness position in Afghanistan meant, if that meant just staying there for perpetuity or what. But you've kind of got that sect of the landscape. And then you've also got the sect of the Tucker Carlsons who full Russia, full Russia. I mean, Carlson said on his show, why is it loyalty to you? Why is it loyalty if it's to Ukraine, but it's betrayal if it's to Russia, essentially. And Tom Malinowski, this representative from New Jersey, said he was shocked that his office was getting flooded with calls after this Tucker Carlson segment from people saying, you know, Russia's position is reasonable. Why are we fighting against it? So it is kind of interesting. You've got the old guard, the old kind of pugnacious guard, and then you've got the whatever's kind of grown out of the Trumpism part. That's like, Putin's our boy. So what's the problem
Yeah,
here?
yeah, it is kind of a funny thing, and to a great extent, the GOP has allowed itself, and I guess in some terms succeeded in both being the sort of the Russia hawks. Oh, you're going easy on Russia, and
Hmm.
also the leader of their party is like the most pro Russia guy. I mean, it's the whole thing is is a bit nonsensical. I mean, one of the things, there was actually a quote in an interview about with some Russia specialist, and they were and the person asked him, like, do you think Russia thinks that Biden's weak because of Afghanistan? And it was an interesting answer, because I think this is the answer that people who actually run militaries and are involved in this great power kind of stuff, they saw it as smart, not weak. There's no great powers do not become great powers or maintain great powers by never cutting their losses anywhere. That's how you get overstretched and collapse, basically. You have to, even a great power, even the dominant global power has to, you can't be everywhere at the same time. You can't, and you can't be focused on Taiwan and Ukraine, both of which, for complicated reasons, we have a lot of very real national security economic investments in, because you're kind of bleeding out in Afghanistan, where our interests are much more minimal, despite all that stuff about, oh, as soon as you leave, zombie bin Laden's going to come back and there's going to be another World Trade Center attack. So we've always had, I mean, this was kind of a lot of what the 1960s and 1970s were about in in national security political wrangling. Was, you pull out of you pull out of Vietnam, and suddenly you're weak, and they're going to come at us through through that one mountain gap in Germany or something like that. There's, being doing foreign policy and being a great power is not about never cutting your losses and always seeing it through. It's making good decisions about when you do which. It's just, as it is in life, right? That's what life is like, that too. You got to. It's not about always doing one thing or another. It's figuring out with limited information when to do what. The one thing I will add to this, and I think it's something that, again, is not as on the radar as it should be. Russia supplies about 40% of the natural gas to Europe. Uh, if you get a military confrontation and a ton of sanctions, it's not impossible. Russia just cuts off that supply, at least temporarily, right? I mean, they need the money too. They can't just, but they could really create like a kind of an economic crisis in Europe, or at least a massive spike in energy. So this kind of thing, you think, well, look, I don't live in Ukraine, not my problem, and I don't care about U.S. credibility and stuff. Well, it's tied up with all these other things, and you do probably care about a big spike in energy prices that's going to make inflation temporarily go to 15% or something like that. So there's a lot of different moving pieces here that make it all pretty complicated, you know, pretty
Yep.
complicated.
Okay, let's move on before we get to questions briefly. We've had some good news for democracy out of Alabama, of all places, because a panel of 3 judges, 2 Trump appointees, 1 Clinton, knocked down the map saying that it was a violation of the VRA by not drawing more than one district where Black voters will probably get to choose the candidate of their choice. The Alabama AG, Steve Marshall, has already appealed to the 11th Circuit. It's very likely that this will advance to the Supreme Court, where we know that at least Clarence Thomas thinks that Section 2 of the VRA does not cover racial gerrymandering. So, you know, long way to go, I guess. But of a panel of 2 Trump appointees, it still kind of takes you aback that they knocked this down, even though, on its face, Black residents make up 27% of the population in Alabama, yet they're a majority in only one of the 7 House seats that the state gets. So, I've been working on a different redistricting story this week and kind of asked those experts, by the way, what do you think about the Alabama case? And 201, they were all like, this is a big sign of hope in what looked like a potentially hopeless landscape, because you just at this point kind of expect that right-wing judge appointees will not be amenable to these challenges against gerrymandered maps, particularly now that the Voting Rights Act has been so thoroughly gutted by the Supreme Court.
Well, it does seem here like the the folks in Alabama, the folks running politics in Alabama kind of thought the same thing.
Mhm.
That they thought it was sort of like it is like with Roe now, like they're looking to get rid of Roe, so we can do
Right.
anything, and the Supreme Court will just have our back and validate it, and we'll be making progress. And it does seem like, I mean, again, that you're basically piling all the African American vote into one very very black district, and basically uh, blacks are kind of excluded in all the other districts. It seems like they thought they could get away with anything, and even, I mean, I give these Trump judges credit more than I would have expected, but it does seem like they pushed it too far, and even these Trump judges were basically like, "Hey, this is this is kind
Mhm.
of doesn't cut it on its face."
And this is on the heels of some other, positive redistricting news for the reform minded among us, which includes that the Ohio Supreme Court already knocked down the state legislative and congressional maps for violating a state constitutional prohibition on partisan gerrymandering. And then the North Carolina Supreme Court has already kind of preemptively pushed back the state's primaries to allow for time for the challenges against the GOP drawn maps. So, more cases where kind of extreme gerrymanders are running into some kind of legal buzzsaw. We'll see the full extent of that, but there's some promising signs in a landscape that I think looked very bleak for a long time.
Yeah, no, that is it is encouraging. It is
Yep.
encouraging.
Okay, so now let's take a couple questions. The first is from Zach, who says, "With hindsight being 2020, do you still think it was the right move for Biden and the Democrats to pass BIF without the Build Back Better bill? Um, doesn't Biden look even weaker now that he got nothing for all the work he got done and the assurances he gave to fellow Democrats on Build Back Better?" So, this question is about, it feels like years and years ago at this point, but basically when Democrats allowed for the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better reconciliation bill to be decoupled, and to pass the infrastructure one first after having a couple showdowns in the House where House progressives said, no, we're not going to allow these to be decoupled. We don't trust Manchin and Sinema enough to pass the reconciliation piece afterwards without
Right.
holding the infrastructure bill as leverage. And then they basically kind of conceded and said the president has, promised he's going to get this done. And that's, how things went forward.
Right.
And, I don't know, even at the time when progressives kind of, quote unquote caved, I felt that if I was a progressive in the House, I probably would not have voted for Biff. I very much understand the stance that some of them took by not, because they were absolutely right. Manchin and Sinema proved not to be trustworthy. But by the same token, we just went through the gauntlet enough times before that I really think it had become very clear that Manchin and Sinema didn't care enough about the bipartisan infrastructure bill to ensure the survival of reconciliation, and would have been fairly happy if neither passed. So, to some degree, I think getting what they could done, doing what they could do was ultimately the right move.
Yeah, that's where I am too. I mean, I was very, very, very pro linkage up until the point when they delinked, and I think, very painfully, I think that was the right decision. Obviously, I wish it would have helped get to passing the Build Back Better bill. And again, they're talking about taking this up again in the spring. So I don't think we can totally rule out that a version of it is still going to happen. But assuming this is it, yeah, I still think it was, painful as it is, the right decision because, as Kate says, basically, I think both of them were ready for the infrastructure bill to go down. I don't. The reason I changed my mind on that is that it was not forcing them to um, play ball on the Build Back Better. It was basically just going to be forever in this back and forth that made the Democrats seem both weak and sort of contemptible, just kind of a joke. And you probably weren't going to get either. And I think that Build Back Better was definitely the more important bill, but I wasn't in that camp who saw the infrastructure bill as either a negative or kind of, who cares. I think it was a good piece of, not a perfect piece of, but better that it passed than not. And it was just clear that it was not leveraged to get Build Back Better passed. We would, if they hadn't made that decision, we would still be in the sort of Groundhog Day, you know, that we'd been in for 6 months. So yes, I think it was the right decision, even though it hasn't led to what I certainly would have preferred.
My my biggest quibble with the handling of the moving of these two pieces of legislation is I'm still really hung up on the fact that Schumer had that memo that Manchin and he, kind of weirdly signed that laid out Manchin's priorities, how big he would let the bill get, everything like that. And not even that Schumer didn't share it, like, I understand that he probably genuinely thought he would be able to move Manchin and change his mind on stuff, but I really fundamentally don't understand why that didn't inform the expectation game at all. I feel like they got that information, and then they were like, "Meh, yeah, we'll move him. In the meantime, let's keep talking about a $6 trillion bill as if that's anywhere on the table."
Well,
That to
wasn't
me was the
wasn't that
biggest
also when
point.
they were? I mean, I agree with your basic point, but wasn't that thing signed or whatever or
Mhm.
initialed at the point at which the model was 3.5, not 6? I think it was. I
Yeah, that
think it
might
was.
be right.
But
I'm
but same
kind of
but
being
same
hyperbolic. Yeah.
but same difference. I take your point. Yeah, sort of. I mean, it's pretty difficult negotiating with a bad faith negotiator.
Yeah,
And
that's
and and
true.
and with Manchin, it almost it almost gives him too much credit to say bad faith. It's more kind of like someone who's just making it up as they go along and doesn't feel bound by anything. I mean, I in some ways the biggest thing to take away from that is that they weren't really agreeing to anything, I think. I mean, like it was basically Manchin saying, "Okay, here's, I'm not promising to go above this." And Schumer initialed it and said, "Okay, cool, I hear you. We're going to try to get you to go higher." That's not an agreement in any sense, but the real takeaway, if you want to think about it, to sort of get a sense of what this negotiation was about, he was saying, "I will vote for this size. I won't
True.
commit to going higher. I will vote for this size." And they eventually got down to that size. They still wouldn't vote for it. So, it's
Yeah, but Josh, that's because they
yeah.
used his name in a in a
Yes,
press release. Like, please give
exactly.
that crime against humanity the stature it
Yeah,
deserved.
yeah. So, it's but to the larger point, yes, I get what you're saying, and I kind of agree about that point at some level, kind of like you got everybody really thinking 3.5 was in the bag. That was pretty deflating when we found out that wasn't the case. But again, he was saying 1.5 or whatever it was in the bag, but that also wasn't in the bag. There was no bag, or the bag was only had an opening on both sides. So it's pretty hard to know how to manage that, or to say, okay, he's only committing to X when he wasn't committing to, he wasn't committing to that, and who knows?
Yeah,
It's hard to negotiate with a bad faith negotiator, to put it
I think
mildly.
that's fair. Okay, and now we have a question from Mike who says he has a mansion question. What does he want? Let's assume Build Back Better and voting rights are completely off the table. What does he want to be talking about? What is the issue he wants to show up to work on every day? I think this is such an interesting question because it gets to the heart of my despair about Joe Manchin, which is basically that so few people get the chance to dramatically change the course of history. And he is positioned in a place where he could do that. He could get legislatively absolutely anything he wanted. He could get bill after bill that is stuffed to the brim with stuff that helps West Virginians, and he could have them all named after him if he wanted. But the myopia of his imagination is such that he's decided that being bipartisan, being centrist means not doing anything. It means not taking hard votes. It means not, thinking of imaginative legislation. It means not dwelling on any of the ills that plague his state and thinking of ways to fix them. It basically means being pretty cheerful, doing nothing, coming into work, telling reporters, oh, we're talking, we're negotiating, things are going well, and leaving it at that. And that, I think, is just one of the saddest parts of his kind of psychic landscape.
Yeah, I mean, when you say, like, what does he want to be? What does he want the agenda to move to? What does he want to be talking about? What's his agenda? His agenda is just talking to reporters about whatever is on the agenda. He doesn't have any ideal. That's always been the thing with him. He likes being a senator. He likes the attention. He likes, hanging out with lobbyists and other senators on his boat, and that's just kind of his shtick. And I don't, it's not even like, it would be one thing if he was some sort of, like, hardcore anti-spending dude, and this was going to be his legacy, stopping the BBB. It wasn't even that. It just kind of wasn't into it, and heard different things, and Biden became less popular, and it's just, he has no agenda. He wants the backslapping to continue. He likes the attention from reporters. He just wants to be in the mix, and that's his agenda, which is pretty pretty unfortunate, right? I mean, I guess it's a little better than his agenda being switching party to the Republicans, and passing a big tax cut. Looks like he'll help out on the judicial confirmations. That's great. Quite literally could be worse. Could be worse.
There's
But
that
that's his.
optimism.
Yeah, but that's his agenda, is that he has no agenda. His agenda is to be in the mix, and have microphones in front of his face, for whatever it is we're talking about.
And that's that.
And that is that. Well, it's not quite that, because remember, the Josh Marshall podcast is brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee, and you can get 25% off at Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. But after that is it.
All right.
So we'll
We'll see
talk to
you
you
next
next
week.
week. Later.
The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and subscribe wherever you listen.